If you've ever felt like you're living a life that isn't your own, like every decision, every sacrifice is made to please someone else, then this story is for you. It's a journey from being a pawn in someone else's game to becoming the master of your own destiny. I want to ask you before we even begin, have you ever felt that pressure? The kind that makes you shrink into yourself? That makes you believe your own desires don't matter? Share your story in the comments below. And as you watch, hit that like button and subscribe to join a community dedicated to real-life stories of liberation and self-discovery. I've always been good at following a script. My life's been a series of carefully choreographed scenes, directed by others. Every morning, the same routine. Coffee, toast, a quick check of the bills I've already paid. It's a life of quiet desperation, the kind that whispers to you in the dark when you're sure no one is listening. My name is Elias Vance, and for as long as I can remember, my life has been a well-oiled machine, powered by the needs and desires of my family, particularly my older brother Julian. Elias, what are you doing with that nonsense? You're an engineer, not a child with a coloring book. We need you at the family business. Your designs can wait. Our family's future can't. Julian has always been the voice of reason, the patriarch, even though he's only 2 years my senior. He and his wife, Clara, have always held the reins. Their every word a command, their every need a new item on my to-do list. The family business, a small but once profitable manufacturing company, has been their kingdom, and I, their loyal subject. I'm the quiet accountant, the silent partner, the one who cleans up their messes while they bask in the spotlight. I've been the dependable rock, the one they turn to when their lavish lifestyle exceeds their income. And it always does. My small but consistent salary from the business is what keeps their over-the-top spending afloat. They see it as my duty, my sacrifice for the family name. Elias, darling, we've had a little setback. The new yacht club membership is a bit more than we budgeted for, and the twins' equestrian lessons, well, let's just say they're quite talented. We're going to need you to readjust your investments. It's just a temporary cash flow issue, Elias. We'll pay you back. You know we're good for it. This is for the family, after all. For our reputation. You wouldn't want people thinking the Vance name is struggling, would you? The family was always their excuse. Their retirement accounts, their expensive vacations, their children's private school tuition. It was all my problem. They had a way of turning my quiet security into a public spectacle of their success, a facade that I was paying for. For years I told myself it was fine, that this was what family did. But the whispers of desperation were getting louder. The pressure was mounting. My life was shrinking, not expanding. I had put my own dreams, my passion for design, my desire to travel, on hold for so long. I wasn't even sure what they were anymore. I was 48 years old, and my only companion was my meticulously organized apartment and a growing mountain of debt. Debt they had conveniently transferred to me. Julian's latest investment scheme had completely drained my savings. He had convinced me to co-sign on a business loan for a new venture, a high-end restaurant he was sure would be a goldmine. The money, he assured me, would be paid back in a matter of months. Of course, the restaurant failed within a year, and the debt landed squarely on my shoulders. Clara, always the pragmatist, had come up with a solution. I needed to sell my apartment, my one bedroom on the outskirts of the city. My one anchor in this chaotic sea of family obligations was to be sacrificed. They said I could move in with them into their guest room, where I could help out more directly. They made it sound like a gift, a selfless act of love. I knew what it was. The final step in their total takeover, the constant calls, the emotional manipulation, the endless favors that were never repaid. It was a familiar pattern. But this time, it was different. This time, they weren't just taking my money. They were taking my home. They were demanding I give up the only space that was truly mine. As I stared at those bills, A new feeling took root. It was not a flicker of defiance anymore, but a burning, undeniable resolve. I wasn't a hero, a victim, or a savior. I was just Elias, and I was about to find out what that meant, even if it meant stepping out of the role my family had written for me. The call with Julian and Clara ended with a final, chilling note of their entitlement. Elias had not committed to anything, but their tone left no room for negotiation. His apartment was, in their minds, already sold. He hung up the phone, the silence of his small living room feeling heavier than before. The stack of bills sat on his coffee table like a monument to his misplaced loyalty. He picked one up, a notice for a missed loan payment on Julian's failed restaurant. The letter was addressed to him, Elias Vance, the co-signer. He was financially entangled in their web, a fact they had exploited with expert precision. The next morning, the demands began to escalate. Elias's phone buzzed with an urgent text from Julian. "Call me about the apartment. We need to move fast. Found a buyer who will pay cash." "Great news!" Elias ignored the text, a small act of rebellion that felt as monumental as a revolution. He went to work, to the same accounting firm where he had toiled for 20 years. The same firm Julian had pushed him into, telling him it was stable and a good fit for his meticulous nature. Elias had always secretly believed it was a good fit for their needs, a steady income stream they could drain at will. He sat at his desk, staring at spreadsheets, but his mind was on a different ledger, the ledger of his life. The email from Julian arrived a few hours later, more formal and aggressive. "Elias, I need you to sign the power of attorney forms I'm sending you. It will make the sale of your apartment easier. You won't even have to worry about the paperwork." The email was a cold, calculated move. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Signing that document would be the final seal on his fate, a relinquishing of his last bit of control. Elias felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He wasn't just a pawn anymore. He was a piece they were trying to remove from the board entirely. He looked around the office at the other accountants with their heads down, their lives neatly compartmentalized. He wondered how many of them were living a life they hadn't chosen. He was beginning to see his own life from the outside, like a stranger watching a particularly sad play. That evening, the doorbell rang. It was Julian and Clara, their smiles plastic and their expensive clothes, a stark contrast to Elias's quiet existence. They carried a bottle of wine and a manila envelope. "We thought we'd stop by and celebrate your new beginning," Clara chirped, her voice too sweet. Elias let them in, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. They sat on his modest sofa, their presence filling the small space with an overwhelming sense of suffocation. Julian laid the envelope on the coffee table, the very one where Elias had just been looking at the bills. "These are the forms. Just a formality," Julian said, his eyes hard and unwavering. "A lawyer friend of ours drafted them up. It's all completely legitimate." Elias knew it was a lie. Nothing they did was completely legitimate. He looked from the envelope to Julian's face, then to Clara, who was already talking about the new furniture they would buy for the guest room once he moved in. She was decorating a cage for him, and she was doing it with a smile on her face. A wave of nausea washed over him. The air was thick with their expectations, their manipulation. Elias looked at his hands, the same hands that had once sketched vibrant new inventions. Now they just signed papers and paid bills. This was the moment. He could pick up the pen they had conveniently placed next to the envelope, sign away his life, and continue the slow, painful drift into a future that was not his. Or he could finally say no. He felt a sudden, profound calm. He picked up the wine bottle instead of the pen and set it down on the floor. The thud, a punctuation mark. "I'm not selling the apartment," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. Julian's smile vanished. Clara's laugh died in her throat. "What did you say?" Julian asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I said I'm not selling the apartment. It's my home. I'm not moving in with you. I'm not signing any forms." Julian stood up, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. "Elias, don't be ridiculous. This is for the family. You're overreacting. We're in this together." Elias stood as well, meeting his brother's gaze for the first time in years. "No, we're not," he said, the words gaining strength with each syllable. "I'm in this alone, and I have been for a long time. This is my debt, Julian, a debt you saddled me with, and this is my home. You don't get to decide what happens to it." Clara stepped in, her tone shifting to one of condescending concern. "Elias, we're trying to help you. You're drowning in debt, and this is the only way out." Elias let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "I know exactly how much debt I'm in. I'm the one paying for it. For your failed restaurant, for your luxury cars, for your children's private schools. It's always been me, cleaning up after your mistakes." The air crackled with their stunned silence. Elias had never, in his entire life, spoken to them this way. He had always been the quiet, dependable one. He walked over to the stack of bills and picked up the loan notice. "This is the last time. The last time I bail you out. I'm done. I'm not selling my home and I'm not giving you any more money. You'll have to figure out your own financial problems from now on." Julian's face turned a deep shade of red. "You ungrateful. We've given you everything. We put you through school. We got you this job. This is how you repay us?" The familiar script. Elias had heard it 1,000 times, and each time it had worked. But not today. "You put me through school and into this job so you could control me. You didn't give me a life, Julian. You bought one, and you've been living it for me ever since." He gestured toward the door. "Now I think it's time you leave, and take your paperwork with you. I won't be signing anything." Julian grabbed the envelope from the table, his movements jerky with fury. He and Clara stormed out of the apartment, their expensive shoes clattering down the hallway. The door slammed shut behind them, and for the first time in years, Elias was truly alone. He stood in the middle of his living room, surrounded by his things, and felt a quiet, profound sense of peace. The knots in his stomach began to loosen. The air in his apartment, once suffocating, felt clear and fresh. He had taken his first terrifying step toward freedom, but he knew this was just the beginning. They would not give up easily. He had defied the script, and they would do everything in their power to force him back into his role. The quiet triumph Elias felt after Julian and Clara's departure was short-lived. He knew his act of defiance would not be met with silence. The morning after the confrontation, his phone began to ring. It was Julian. Elias's hand hovered over the answer button, a familiar fear clutching at his chest. For years, the sound of his brother's name on his screen had been a summons he couldn't ignore. But today the feeling was different. He let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, another call came. Then another. The sound of the ringing filled his small apartment, a persistent, aggressive demand for his attention. When he finally checked the voicemails, Julian's voice, usually a booming instrument of charm, was now a snarling echo of rage. "You think you can do this? You think you can cut us off? We are your family, Elias. We made you who you are. You'll regret this. I promise you." The threats were both a predictable and terrifying response. Elias had anticipated anger, but the raw venom in Julian's voice sent a shiver down his spine. He knew this was not just about the money or the apartment anymore. It was about power and control. Later that day, Clara sent him a flurry of passive-aggressive texts. "We are just so worried about you, Elias. You're not thinking clearly. This debt is going to destroy you. We were trying to save you from yourself." The manipulation was so transparent, so insulting. It almost made him laugh. They were not worried about him. They were worried about their own precarious financial situation. They were scrambling to find a new source of funds, and Elias's steadfastness had created a massive obstacle in their path. The pressure was a constant, insidious hum in his life. At work, he felt a new kind of anxiety. He kept his head down, focused on his tasks. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He was a man who had dared to break from his family, a family known for its wealth and social standing. He imagined the gossip spreading, the whispers about his sudden erratic behavior, The next morning, the escalation became more personal. He received a call from his niece, Isabella. She was only 19, the more sensitive of Julian and Clara's twins. And her voice was laced with a genuine sadness that was hard to bear. "Uncle Elias? Mom and Dad are so upset. They say you're being selfish, and that you're tearing the family apart." Elias's heart ached. He knew this was an orchestrated move. They were using their child to get to him, knowing he would never be able to handle her sadness. He tried to explain, to tell her about the debt, about how her parents had taken advantage of him for years. But she cut him off, her voice shaky. "I don't understand all that, Uncle Elias. I just know Dad says we might have to sell the house if you don't help them. Where would we go? We'd be a public spectacle." The guilt hit him like a physical blow. He loved Isabella. He had always been the quiet, supportive uncle, the one she would turn to for help with her calculus homework when Julian was too busy to be bothered. And now, they were using her as a weapon. That night, alone in his apartment, the silence was no longer peaceful. It was deafening, filled with the echoes of Julian's threats and Isabella's tearful plea. He couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep. The pressure was immense, a crushing weight on his chest. He was a man who had been defined by his role as the obedient, dependable one. Breaking free meant facing not just their anger, but their carefully crafted narrative of him as a selfish, ungrateful villain. He knew what they were doing. They were trying to isolate him, to make him believe that he was truly alone, that he had nobody to turn to. He felt the old self-doubt creeping in, the fear that maybe they were right, that he was a bad person for putting himself first, for the first time in his life. He found himself picking up the phone to call Julian, to apologize, to tell him he would sign the papers, to go back to being the person he was always supposed to be. His thumb hovered over the contact. He could see his life stretching out before him, a life of endless sacrifice, of watching his own dreams fade to black as he propped up his brothers. He would sell the apartment, move into the guest room, and his existence would become nothing more than an extension of their needs. His life would cease to be his own entirely. He looked around his apartment, at the worn armchair where he had spent countless quiet evenings with a book, at the kitchen where he had experimented with new recipes, at the bedroom where he had finally found a moment of peace after a long day. This was his sanctuary, his quiet space in a world of demands. He couldn't give it up. He wouldn't. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but something else was growing alongside it, a quiet, fierce anger. It wasn't the same as Julian's rage. It was a righteous fury, a fire of self-preservation. It was the anger of a man who had been pushed too far, of a man who had finally realized he was worth saving. He put the phone down, not with a flourish, but with a quiet, firm resolve. The breaking point had arrived. It wasn't one grand climactic event. It was the slow, painful accumulation of years of neglect and manipulation, culminating in Julian and Clara's final heartless demand and their use of his beloved niece. They had used every weapon in their arsenal, threats, guilt, and emotional blackmail, and he had withstood it all. He realized that the only person who could truly hurt him was himself, by caving in and going back to the way things were. He had reached the end of the road. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. The only way out was to stand and fight. He was no longer Elias the obedient. He was just Elias, a man who, for the first time in his life, was about to make a decision for himself, and for himself alone. He had no plan, no safety net, and nobody he could turn to. He was alone, but for the first time in his life, he was truly free. With a new and unfamiliar resolve, Elias knew he couldn't face this battle alone. He needed a strategy, a plan that went beyond simply saying no. The first person who came to mind was not a family member, but an old friend, Anya Sharma. They had met years ago in a college engineering course, and though their career paths had diverged, he into accounting, she into law, they had always maintained a quiet, steadfast friendship. Elias had always admired her intellect and her fierce sense of justice, qualities he had long suppressed in himself. He hadn't spoken to her in a few months, and the thought of reaching out, of admitting the extent of his manipulation, filled him with a new kind of anxiety. But it was nothing compared to the dread of going back to his old life. He sent her a simple text. "Anya, are you free for a coffee? I need some advice." Her reply was almost immediate. "Elias." "Of course. Name the time and place." The next day, they met at a small independent coffee shop far from his office and his home. Elias had chosen it specifically for its anonymity. He needed to be in a neutral space, away from any potential prying eyes. When he saw Anya, she looked just as he remembered. Her eyes were sharp and knowing, but her expression was one of genuine warmth. They exchanged pleasantries, but Elias couldn't beat around the bush. He took a deep breath and began to lay out the story he had spent a lifetime trying to hide. He started with the small favors, the temporary loans that had never been repaid. He talked about Julian's and Clara's growing demands, their extravagant lifestyle, and his role in supporting it. He spoke about the failed business venture and the crushing debt that had landed in his lap. He described their latest plot, the plan to force him to sell his apartment, and the emotional blackmail that had followed his refusal. As he spoke, Anya didn't interrupt. She simply listened, her expression shifting from concern to quiet fury. When he finished, the silence in the small coffee shop felt deafening. He felt a wave of shame, of embarrassment at having allowed himself to be controlled for so long. Anya finally spoke, her voice low and steady. "Elias, I'm not surprised. Julian has always been a parasite. I just never knew the extent of his hold on you." Her words were not a judgment, but a confirmation of his fears. It gave him an unexpected sense of relief. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't being selfish. He was being exploited. "You've come to the right place," she continued. "As a lawyer specializing in estate and financial law, I've seen this kind of thing before. It's not just manipulation. It's financial abuse, but we can fight it." Her confidence was a lifeline. For the first time, Elias felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't just a victim. He was a person with a case. Anya then outlined a secret strategy. "First, we need to gather evidence. Everything. Every text message, every email, every voicemail. I want a timeline, a detailed log of every financial transaction you've made on their behalf." Elias's meticulous nature, which Julian had used to his advantage, was now his greatest weapon. He had kept every single piece of correspondence, every receipt, every cancelled check. He was a human archive of his own victimization. "Next," Anya said, her voice firm, "we need to secure your financial position. We will work to sever your ties to Julian's failed venture and to protect your assets. We will also need to review the co-signing agreement you have with Julian and see if there are any loopholes we can exploit." Elias had never even considered these possibilities. He had just assumed he was trapped. Anya's plan was a masterpiece of legal and emotional strategy. She stressed the importance of discretion. "You cannot let them know you're talking to me. Julian will try to discredit you, to tell everyone you've gone mad. We need to be one step ahead. Every conversation from now on, you'll need to record it. Every communication, you will need to save it. We are building a case, Elias, and we need to be prepared for anything." This was new territory for Elias. He was used to hiding, not preparing for a battle. He felt a newfound sense of purpose, a focus he hadn't felt since he was a young man with a passion for design. He was no longer just the accountant. He was a silent investigator, a man on a mission to reclaim his life. Over the next few weeks, Elias led a double life. By day, he was the same quiet, unassuming accountant, enduring Julian's increasingly desperate and aggressive calls and texts, and Clara's weepy pleas. He maintained a neutral facade, giving them just enough to think they might still have a chance to break him. He would say things like, "I'm just so stressed about everything, Julian. I need time to think." This was enough to keep them off his back while he worked with Anya behind the scenes. By night, he was a different person. He meticulously organized the evidence. Emails from Julian demanding money for emergencies. Voicemails of him threatening to ruin Elias if he didn't cooperate. Receipts for lavish dinners and vacations that were clearly paid for with Elias's money. He felt like a detective piecing together a long, complex, and tragic crime. The victim was himself. The process was both painful and liberating. Each document he filed, each text he saved, was a confirmation of the emotional and financial abuse he had endured. It was like peeling back layers of a wound he had pretended wasn't there. He was also beginning to feel a sense of power. He was no longer just Elias the victim. He was Elias the investigator. He was taking control of the narrative, preparing to write a new one for his life. The shame he had felt at the beginning was slowly being replaced by a righteous fury. He was no longer just fighting for himself, but for every part of himself that Julian and Clara had tried to kill. The old creative Elias, the dreamer, the man who had once believed in a future of his own making. He was coming back to life, fueled by the slow, methodical process of taking back his power. The showdown was coming, and for the first time in his life, Elias was ready for it. The night of the confrontation arrived as a quiet, ordinary Tuesday. Elias had meticulously planned every detail with Anya. He had invited Julian and Clara to his apartment for what he called a final honest conversation about his financial troubles. They had agreed, no doubt thinking it was his surrender, the moment he would finally cave and hand over the keys to his life. He was ready for them. He had rehearsed the words, the tone, the precise order of events a dozen times. Yet, as he waited for the doorbell to ring, a cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. The fear of Julian's unpredictable temper, the shame of Clara's withering judgment, was a familiar and deeply ingrained part of his psyche. When the bell finally chimed, Elias took a deep, fortifying breath. He was no longer the boy who feared disappointing his brother. He was a man with a plan, a man with a lawyer, and a man who was about to stand up for himself for the first time in his life. He opened the door to find Julian and Clara looking uncharacteristically somber. Julian held a bottle of whiskey, a peace offering that felt more like a bribe. Clara carried a freshly baked cake, an absurdly domestic gesture that was clearly meant to convey their unconditional love. They entered his apartment, their presence once again filling the space with an air of condescending ownership. "We just want to fix this, Elias," Julian said, his voice a smooth, practiced instrument of concern. "We're family. We're in this together." "Are we, Julian?" Elias asked, his voice steady. "Because for the last 20 years it's felt like I've been in it alone, bailing you out of one self-inflicted crisis after another." Julian's facade of concern cracked instantly. "What are you talking about? We've given you everything. We found you a job. We've supported you. You found me a job so you could control my income." Elias interrupted, his voice gaining strength. "You've supported me by using me as a personal ATM, and I've kept a record of it all." He gestured to his coffee table, where he had laid out a series of documents, folders filled with emails, printed bank statements, and a meticulously organized timeline of their financial demands. Julian and Clara stared at the folders, their expressions a mix of disbelief and panic. "What is this, Elias? Are you trying to blackmail us?" Clara's voice was high-pitched, a frantic note of fear creeping in. "This isn't blackmail, Clara. This is an accounting of my life," Elias said. He picked up the first folder. "This is a statement from 3 years ago. You needed $15,000 for a new luxury car. You told me it was a loan for a business expansion. It was never repaid." He then held up another document. "This is an email from you, Julian, asking for $20,000 for your country club membership. You called it an investment opportunity. I have the wire transfer receipt right here." Elias continued, systematically laying out the evidence, each document a nail in the coffin of their lies. He showed them the co-signing agreement for the failed restaurant, highlighting the fine print they had conveniently left out. He brought up the vacation photos from the trips he had funded, the private school tuitions he had covered, and the endless emergencies that had drained his savings. He spoke calmly, without anger, the lack of emotion in his voice more damning than any accusation. "You've been treating me like a resource, not a person," Elias continued, his voice no longer trembling. "You sold my dreams to fund your lifestyle. You drained me, emotionally and financially, and when I finally said no, you used your own daughter to try and make me feel guilty." The mention of Isabella's call struck a nerve. Julian's face contorted with rage, and he lunged forward, his hand clenching into a fist. "How dare you?" he snarled. "You're a disgrace to this family. You've lost your mind. This is all a fabrication." Clara, pale and visibly shaken, grabbed Julian's arm. "Julian, stop. This is a bad idea." Elias stood his ground. He was not afraid. Not anymore. "It's not a fabrication, Julian. It's the truth. And it's all documented. Every single lie, every single manipulation. I have it all. And so does my lawyer. Her name is Anya Sharma. She's been building a case for financial abuse and fraud. She's been a wonderful help to me." The mention of a lawyer had the desired effect. Julian's face went white. The bravado, the anger, the sense of entitlement, it all seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a cold, calculating fear. He looked at the folders on the table as if they were live grenades. "You can't do this," Julian whispered, his voice stripped of its power. "This will ruin us." "That's a risk you should have considered before you decided to risk my entire life savings," Elias said, his voice now a quiet, unwavering force. "I'm not here to ruin you, Julian. I'm here to reclaim my life. The apartment is not for sale. I am no longer your bank. From now on, you and Clara will have to manage your own finances. This is my home, my life, and my future. You are no longer a part of it." He gestured to the door, a silent but powerful command. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you, leave, and don't call me again." The silence in the room was absolute. Julian, for the first time in his life, seemed speechless, his face a roadmap of defeat. He and Clara gathered their things in a stunned, hurried motion, and left, the silence of their departure a stark contrast to their usual clamor. The door closed and Elias stood alone in his apartment, the folders of his pain spread out on the table before him. He hadn't just stood up to them. He had dismantled their entire operation. He hadn't just said no. He had taken his power back. The fear was gone, replaced by a profound sense of liberation. The hardest part was over, or so he thought. He knew their rage would be swift, and their retaliation would be brutal. The fight had only just begun. The immediate silence after Julian and Clara's departure was not a peaceful one. It was the tense calm before a storm. Elias knew they would not accept defeat quietly. The first volley came a few hours later, in the form of a blistering text from Julian. "You think you've won? You think a lawyer and some paperwork can save you? You have no idea what you're up against, Elias. I'm not the only one who thinks you've lost your mind. The whole family is talking about this." Then came a wave of calls and texts from his extended family. His cousin Mark called, his voice thick with a fake concern. "Hey, Elias, I just heard about what happened. Julian says you're being completely unreasonable. He's really worried about you." The message was clear. Julian was already spinning the narrative, painting Elias as the aggressor, the unstable one who had suddenly turned against his own blood. Elias didn't answer. He knew every call was a test, an attempt to get him to defend himself and, in doing so, to admit their version of events. The most painful blow, however, came from his aunt, a woman he had always respected. Her voice on the voicemail was cold and disappointed. "Elias, I'm calling to tell you that this behavior is shameful. Julian has done nothing but try to help you your whole life. You need to apologize and do what's right for the family." The message was devastating. They were a unified front, a powerful force of public opinion, and he was alone against them. He felt a deep, wrenching pain in his heart, He had not only lost his family, but he had lost his identity as the good son, the reliable brother. He was now the villain in their story. The psychological warfare continued. Julian and Clara began to publicly post on social media, using carefully crafted language to elicit sympathy. It's so heartbreaking when family turns their back on you for no reason. Julian wrote in a long melodramatic post. We've always tried to do what's best, but some people just can't be helped. They had a powerful tool in their arsenal. Isabella. They had coached her to post a tearful video, her voice raw with manufactured sadness. I just don't understand why Uncle Elias is being so mean to us. She sobbed into the camera. He's changed so much. I miss my old uncle. The comments section exploded with sympathy and condemnation. Elias felt a profound sense of despair. He knew that the people who were commenting, the family, friends, and distant relatives, would never know the truth. They would only see a heartbroken niece and a selfless, wronged brother. The isolation was crushing. He began to feel paranoid. He saw a car he didn't recognize parked on his street, and wondered if Julian had hired someone to watch him. He felt their eyes on him, a constant judging presence, even when he was alone in his apartment. The carefully laid plans with Anya suddenly felt fragile, insignificant against the emotional and social onslaught he was facing. He thought about his old life, a life where he was controlled, yes, but also a life where he had a place, a role, and a family, however toxic it was. He questioned his decision. Was a life of solitude worth this pain? Was freedom worth the loss of his entire family? The pressure mounted with a new tactic. A few days later, Elias received a formal letter from a different law firm. A stern, legally worded document stating that Julian was considering legal action to recoup the funds Elias stole from the family business. It was a complete fabrication, a baseless claim. But it was still a legal threat that he would have to address. He sent the letter to Anya, who called him immediately. Don't worry about this, Elias. It's an intimidation tactic. We will respond, and we will do it through my office. Just don't engage with them. Don't respond to their calls or texts. Let me be your shield. Anya's words were a comfort, but the weight of the situation was immense. He was fighting a battle on two fronts. The legal one, which felt almost manageable with Anya's help, and the emotional one which was tearing him apart. He felt the old script trying to reassert itself in his mind. Give up, Elias. It's not worth it. You're fighting a losing battle. Just go back to being the person they want you to be. It's easier. He felt the pull of that comfortable, suffocating world. But then, he thought of Julian and Clara in his apartment, their plastic smiles, their condescending tone, and their final cold-eyed demand. He thought of all the years he had wasted, the dreams he had put on hold. He thought of the man he used to be, the creative, vibrant person he saw in the old sketch. He wasn't going back. Not now. Not ever. He knew he had to break the cycle. He deleted Julian, Clara, and the rest of his family's numbers from his phone. He blocked them on social media. It was a final, liberating step. He was severing ties, not just with their physical presence, but with their toxic hold on his mind. The calls still came, from numbers he didn't recognize, but he didn't answer them. The texts still came, but they went into a digital void. He was creating a new space for himself, a space where their voices could no longer reach him. He was still alone, but for the first time, it didn't feel lonely. It felt quiet. It felt peaceful. He had faced the backlash, withstood the emotional trial, and now he was ready to rebuild. He was no longer a pawn. He was the master of his own game, and he was about to make his first real move. The past was behind him, a painful but necessary lesson. The future was unwritten, and for the first time in his life, he was the one holding the pen. With the weight of the past finally lifted, Elias felt a strange sense of buoyancy. The days that followed his confrontation with his family were quiet, a stark contrast to the emotional whirlwind he had endured. The silence, Once a source of loneliness, now felt like a canvas for him to paint a new life. He started small. The first act of self-discovery was a simple one. He went to a local art supply store. The familiar smell of paint, the rows of brushes, the blank canvases, it all stirred a dormant part of his soul. He bought a sketchbook and a set of pencils, the kind he used to use when he was a hopeful young engineer with a passion for design. He wasn't trying to create anything for a product. He was simply drawing for the sheer joy of it. He sketched the view from his window, the intricate patterns of a leaf, the face of a stranger he saw at the coffee shop. The act of creation felt like a conversation with his younger self, a promise to honor the person he had been before Julian and Clara had started writing his life script. He also began to explore his own city. For years, his world had been confined to his apartment, his office, and the occasional visit to his family's sprawling, sterile home. He discovered a local pottery studio and, on a whim, signed up for a beginner's class. His hands, accustomed to the rigid precision of an accountant's ledger, were clumsy at first, but with each misshapen bowl and wobbly vase, he felt a new kind of freedom. He was making things for himself, not for a project, not for a profit, and certainly not for anyone else's approval. The studio was a haven, a place where he could get his hands dirty, where the only demands were those of the clay. He met new people, not colleagues or family members, but fellow artists who talked about their work with a passion Elias had long forgotten. He listened to their stories, and for the first time, he found himself sharing his own, not in a way that sought sympathy, but in a way that spoke to his journey. He had been so focused on Julian's and Clara's narrative that he had forgotten to write his own. One evening, after his pottery class, he sat in a quiet park watching the sunset. A woman with kind eyes and a warm smile sat on a nearby bench. They started talking, and Elias found himself for the first time not being the dependable accountant or Julian's brother, but simply Elias. He learned she was a landscape architect, a person who spent her days creating beauty out of chaos. She talked about the importance of giving things room to grow, of setting boundaries for a garden so that it could flourish. Her words resonated deeply with him. He realized that for a long time he had been a garden with no boundaries, allowing the weeds of his family's demands to choke out his own potential. His newfound self-confidence began to seep into other areas of his life. At work, he began to speak up in meetings, offering his own ideas instead of just implementing others. He noticed a new respect from his colleagues, a quiet acknowledgement of his shift. He was no longer the silent man in the corner. He was a valuable member of the team. The change was so profound that his boss, a man who had barely acknowledged his existence for years, called him into his office to commend him on his recent work. The compliment felt strange but powerful. It was validation he hadn't sought but desperately needed. He was also taking control of his finances, a task he had always handled for others but never truly for himself. With Anya's guidance, he renegotiated his debt, found a financial planner who specialized in helping people rebuild their lives, and began to invest in his own future. He set up a modest savings account for his own personal goals. A trip to Italy, a new camera, perhaps even a down payment on a small studio. The money, once a tool of his servitude, was becoming an instrument of his liberation. The pain of the backlash from his family still lingered, a phantom limb that ached on some days. He knew he had lost his blood relatives, but he was slowly, surely, building a new kind of family, a family of choice. He spent his weekends with his pottery class friends, sharing meals and stories. He had coffee with the landscape architect, discussing everything from the art of design to the importance of personal growth. He felt a sense of belonging he had never experienced with his own family, a feeling of being seen and appreciated for who he was, not for what he could provide. Elias was no longer the same man. He was no longer a ghost in his own life, a character in a story written by others. He was the author, the hero, and the main character. He was learning to live, not just to exist. He had found a new purpose, not in serving others, but in nurturing himself. He was healing the wounds of the past by embracing the future. He had been through hell, but he had come out the other side, not broken, but transformed. He had finally learned that the greatest act of love is not to sacrifice yourself for others, but to be strong enough to save yourself. Elias's life, once a small, contained vessel, was beginning to expand. His days were filled with new purpose, his evenings with genuine connection. But he knew this new existence was still anchored to the old one by a few stubborn threads. The legal battle with Julian was one of them. While Anya, his lawyer and friend, had managed to stave off Julian's legal threats with well-crafted, unyielding responses, the constant back and forth was an emotional drain. The legal documents and demands were a constant reminder of the life he was trying to escape. They were a ghost in the machine of his new existence, a phantom limb that still ached. The final severance, he realized, needed to be absolute. He had to make a clean break, not just from their demands, but from their physical presence, from the city they both inhabited. The thought of leaving Portland, the only city he had ever known, filled him with a mix of fear and excitement. It was the ultimate act of liberation, a tangible symbol of his newfound freedom. He spent weeks researching new cities, places with vibrant art scenes, and a quieter pace of life. He considered smaller towns in the Pacific Northwest, then began to look at communities on the East Coast, the Midwest, anywhere that felt entirely new and disconnected from his past. He called Anya and laid out his plan. "I'm going to move. I need a clean slate. I need to be somewhere Julian can't just show up at my door with a new legal threat or a tearful performance." Anya listened, her voice on the other end of the line sounding thoughtful. "That's a powerful move, Elias. It will make the harassment much more difficult for them, but you need to do it right. We need to create a legal firewall." Over the next few months, with Anya's guidance, Elias began the process of severing all remaining ties. He sold his apartment, the same apartment Julian and Clara had tried to pressure him to sell. But this time, he sold it on his own terms. He received a fair price, a significant sum that would serve as the foundation of his new life. He didn't tell anyone, not his work colleagues, not his friends from the pottery studio. Nobody. It was a silent, private victory. He paid off the debt he had accrued on Julian's behalf. A final, definitive act of closing that painful chapter of his life. He changed his bank accounts, his phone number, and his email address, leaving no digital breadcrumbs for them to follow. The physical act of packing up his apartment was a cathartic experience. Each box he filled felt like a symbolic shedding of his old self. He found old photos of his family, pictures of Julian and Clara at their wedding, of his parents with a younger, more hopeful Elias standing awkwardly beside them. He didn't feel anger or sadness looking at them. He felt a quiet, profound sense of detachment. They were no longer the people who controlled his life. They were just characters in a story he had finally finished reading. He kept a few things. A small, chipped teacup his mother had given him, a worn book of poetry he loved, and the old sketch of his design, a reminder of the dreams he was finally ready to pursue. The day he moved was a quiet one. The moving truck arrived early, and he watched as his few belongings were carefully loaded into it. He took one last look at his apartment, the small space that had been his sanctuary and his prison. He locked the door and walked away, not with a sense of loss, but with a feeling of immeasurable relief. He felt lighter than he had in years, as if he had shed a heavy coat he had been forced to wear his entire life. He hadn't told anyone where he was going. He had simply disappeared, a ghost in the world he had once inhabited. His old life was now a memory, a story he could tell, a lesson he had learned. The financial ties were gone, the emotional bonds were broken, and the physical distance was now a reality. He knew Julian and Clara would be furious. He imagined their frantic calls to his old number, their desperate attempts to contact him, to reassert their control. He smiled, Their power over him was gone, and they were the last to know it. Elias had a new city, a new home, and a new life waiting for him. He was no longer Elias the reliable, the dependable, the silent partner. He was just Elias, a man who had finally found the courage to be himself. He had cut the strings, and for the first time he was truly free, ready to write the next chapter of his life, one that was entirely his own. He was a man with a past, but he was no longer a prisoner of it. His new life was not a destination. It was a journey, and he was finally in the driver's seat. It had been a little over a year since Elias had moved. He had settled into a small, vibrant city in the Midwest, a place far removed from the cold, gray life he had left behind. His new home was a comfortable 2-bedroom apartment with a small balcony overlooking a park, a far cry from the cramped, joyless space he once called his own. He had found a part-time job at a local engineering firm, a position that utilized his skills without demanding the soul-crushing hours and constant stress of his old career. He also continued his pottery, renting a small studio space where he could lose himself in the meditative process of creation. He had a few pieces in a local gallery, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing his work appreciated by strangers was a balm to his soul. One afternoon, as he was putting the finishing touches on a new vase, his phone, with its new unfamiliar number, buzzed with a message from an unrecognized sender. He almost ignored it, his default response to any unexpected contact. But something in the text caught his eye. It was from Isabella, his niece. The message was simple and direct. "Uncle Elias, it's Isabella. I know you've changed your number, but I just had to try this. Please don't be mad at me." A wave of emotions, surprise, hope, and a deep-seated sadness, washed over him. He hadn't spoken to her since her tearful video, the one Julian and Clara had used as a weapon against him. He had assumed she was still a willing pawn in their game, a part of the narrative that had cast him as the villain. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the reply button. He remembered her face in that video, the genuine sadness in her eyes, and a part of him, a part he had thought was dead, ached to reach out. He decided to trust his gut. He replied, "Isabella, I'm not mad. How did you get this number?" Her response was immediate. "A friend of a friend of a friend." It was a whole mission. "I've missed you, Uncle Elias, and I wanted to tell you something. I'm so sorry for what I said in that video. They made me do it. They told me you were a bad person and that you hated us, but I know it's not true." The words were a revelation. He hadn't been a villain in her eyes. He had been a victim. He felt a profound sense of relief, a loosening of the last, most painful knot in his heart. Over the next few weeks, their texts became a lifeline for Elias. He learned that after he had moved, Julian and Clara's financial situation had deteriorated rapidly. Without his steady income to fall back on, their lavish lifestyle had become unsustainable. They had to sell their home, move into a much smaller one, and Julian had lost his majority share in the family business. Isabella, now working a part-time job to pay for her own college tuition, was seeing her parents for who they really were. The facade of their perfect, wealthy life had crumbled, and in its place was a reality of financial desperation and constant bickering. "They're always fighting now, Uncle Elias," she texted one night. "They talk about you all the time, saying you ruined our family. But I don't believe it anymore. I see now how they treated you. You weren't the one taking things from us. You were the one giving." The messages from Isabella were a form of vindication. They proved that his decision, however painful, had been the right one. He hadn't just saved himself. He had set an example, however unintentionally, for a younger generation. Isabella was learning, in the crucible of her own family's downfall, the lessons he had learned over a lifetime. She was beginning to understand the difference between true family and a transactional relationship. One day, Isabella sent him a text that surprised him. "I'm coming to your city for a college tour. Can we meet? I want to see you." Elias's heart pounded with anticipation. He hadn't seen her in over a year, and he had no idea what to expect. They agreed to meet at a quiet coffee shop near his new home. When she walked in, she looked different. The entitled, polished sheen of her old life was gone, replaced by a quiet maturity. Her clothes were simple, her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and her eyes, once full of a manufactured sadness, were now clear and honest. They talked for hours. Isabella apologized again, this time in person, her voice full of genuine remorse. "I'm so sorry, Uncle Elias. I was a child. I didn't know any better, but I do now. I saw how they were using me, how they used you. I want to be different." Elias felt tears welling up in his eyes. He hadn't realized how much he had needed to hear those words. He told her about his life, about his pottery and his new job, about the peace he had found. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He told her about the pain of his decision and the liberation that had followed. As they said goodbye, Isabella hugged him tightly. "Thank you for showing me that it's okay to stand up for yourself," she whispered. "And for showing me what a real family looks like." The words hit him hard. He had thought he was a man alone, but he wasn't. He had a glimmer of hope, a new kind of family, not based on blood or obligation, but on a shared understanding of what it means to be truly free. He had lost his old family, but he had found something far more valuable, a connection with someone who saw him for who he truly was. And for the first time in his life, he was no longer a ghost in his own story. A few years had passed since Elias had moved to his new city, and his life was unrecognizable. The old anxieties and burdens had faded into a distant memory, replaced by a profound sense of peace and purpose. His small apartment felt like a sanctuary, a place where he was truly free to be himself. His pottery studio was a haven of creativity, a space where he could lose himself in the tactile joy of molding clay. His art was beginning to gain recognition in the local community, and he had even sold a few pieces, a quiet validation that felt more meaningful than any compliment from his family. He had found a new kind of wealth, one that couldn't be measured in dollars or social standing, but in the richness of his own life. His relationship with Isabella had blossomed into a beautiful, genuine bond. She had become his anchor to the past, a symbol of hope for a different kind of future. She would call him regularly, sharing her struggles and triumphs, her voice now free of the manufactured sadness he had once heard. She had found her own independence, moving into a shared apartment with friends and taking on a more demanding work-study program to pay her way. "They're still the same, Uncle Elias," she had told him one night, her voice heavy with a mature sadness. "They're still looking for a new you. They keep trying to find a new person to save them, but nobody wants the job." Elias didn't feel a sense of triumph when he heard this. He just felt a quiet, profound sadness for them. Their refusal to change had left them trapped in their own self-inflicted misery. One evening, as Elias was having dinner with Anya, who had become a close confidant, she asked him, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had stayed?" Elias took a moment to consider the question. "I've imagined it," he said. "A life of quiet resentment, of watching my own dreams die so theirs could live on. I would have been living in their guest room, a ghost in my own life, with no voice and no power." He shuddered at the thought. The choice, in retrospect, had been a simple one, even if the execution had been agonizing. He had learned that true freedom was not just about breaking away from others. It was about building a life for himself. He had learned that his self-worth was not tied to what he could do for his family, but to who he was as a person. He had found a new kind of love, not one based on obligation and sacrifice, but on mutual respect and genuine connection. His friends from the pottery studio, his colleagues, and especially Anya and Isabella, had shown him what a real family could be. A group of people who support you not because they have to, but because they want to. The money, the debt, the legal threats. It had all been a test, a crucible that had forged him into a new, stronger person. He had been forced to face his deepest fears, to stand up to the people who had controlled him for so long. He had lost his family, but he had found himself. He had given up a life of false security and endless demands and had, in return, received a life of peace, happiness, and purpose. The struggle had been immense, but the reward was immeasurable. He realized now that the ultimate act of liberation was not just about cutting ties, but about building something new in their place. He was no longer running from his past. He was building a future that was entirely his own. His life, once a tragedy of silent obedience, was now a story of self-discovery and resilience. He had learned that the most important relationship you will ever have is the one you have with yourself, and that the greatest act of love is to honor that relationship above all else. He was no longer a pawn. He was a master of his own destiny, and he had finally found his way home. So, if you've ever felt like you're living a life that isn't your own, I want you to remember Elias's story. Remember that you have the power to write your own narrative, to set your own boundaries, and to reclaim your own life. It won't be easy, and it may be painful, but the peace and happiness you find on the other side are worth every single step. If this story resonated with you, and if you've ever had to take a stand for yourself, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on more inspiring stories like this one. You are not alone in your struggle, and your worth is not determined by what you can give to others. Thank you for listening, and may you find the courage to live a life that is truly and authentically your own.